On this question of, why do we have committees in Congress? What would Congress be like without committees? I thought this picture could be indicative of what it might look like. Sort of complete disorganization and chaos. And our friends on the Hill may argue that it feels like this routinely, even with committees. But I think if we didn't have a committee structure, it could be even more jumbled and disorganized and really a complete free-for-all. So the committees are really a way to organize the complex and complicated into something that maybe doesn't feel exactly like this, nice, neat, and buttoned down in a bunch of file cabinets, but it helps us get a little closer to that by bringing more order and organization to the work of the Congress. So, once a history major, always a history major, I thought we'd take a quick look back at, where we came from to get to where we are today. We have a long history with committees. There's really nothing new here. In fact, committees predate the government. Probably the most famous committee many of you learned about was the 5-person panel that was appointed to write what ultimately became the Declaration of Independence by the Continental Congress. There are no references to committees in the Constitution, so there's nothing in that document that requires Congress to have committees. But you do have a history of committees going back to the early years of Congress, when at first they were done primarily in an ad hoc or temporary basis. So makes a lot of sense, right? The government was new, it was a lot smaller, Congress was a lot smaller. You typically had situations where an issue would come about, they would appoint an ad hoc committee to study an issue, write a report, and bring it back to the full body, or to come up with a set of recommendations, but then it would be moved to the full body, and then that committee would complete its work and disband. But as the years went by, there became a need, and they recognized that as the country grew, as the Congress grew, and as the business became more complicated, that it would make sense to have a standing committee system. So you have the roots going back in the House side, actually, to the couple years into the fourth Congress is when you had a first permanent committee created, and the Senate would follow suit over time. And actually, it's not a constant evolution to the number we're at today. You've had this ebb and flow over time, and it was interesting for me. I didn't realize this, but when I was doing a little research, that about 100 years ago, you had nearly 60 standing committees in the House, so much larger than we have today. In terms of the types of committees, really there are 3 main categories, and the majority of our work, the majority of the work that's before you and your organizations is before standing or permanent committees. Committees like Finance, which Chairman Hatch leads, Energy and Commerce, which Mr. Butterfield is on, committees like the Help Committee in the Senate, Appropriations Committees in both chambers, and the House Ways and Means Committee. These are all permanent standing committees that have a jurisdiction over a set defined issues, a set of federal agencies and topics. Then you have a few select committees that are constituted sometimes for a defined limited period of time or sometimes permanent that are put together for, again, a defined topic or topics. And then you have a few joint committees which have members of both the House and the Senate. And just a quick definition issue for some who might not be as familiar, but authorizing versus appropriations. Authorizing committees are the ones who create policies, create new programs, and oversee agencies. But the appropriators are essentially the bank. They have the unenviable task these days of determining which dollar amount goes to which federal department and agency and program. So they have to carve up the actual amount of money and determine how that gets spent. So it's a little bit of yin and yang here. You need to have an appropriations committee that functions and that funds programs for them to be fully implemented. And if you don't have an appropriation, then you can have an authorized program that does little else, but sit in law as an authorized program. So both are extremely important. So as I noted a few minutes ago, committees have different roles and responsibilities, including jurisdictions over issues, sectors of the economy, and the whole federal agencies, governments, departments, and agencies. These lines are not always nice and neat. There is some areas where you have blurring, where committees do share jurisdiction over topics, or sometimes there's a little bit of jockeying for turf. We like to think that doesn't happen, but that does happen. And committees do play a critical role in holding hearings, debating issues that are of importance and focus before these agencies, and ultimately helping really develop and craft the legislation that impacts these programs and areas of our economy. So while any member of Congress can introduce a bill on any issue, the members of the committee are critically important, because I would say this is, if we were in high school, this would be the ultimate in crowd here, because they are the group that gets to be in the room from the get-go that helps develop the legislation and then helps refine it further throughout the process and has significant say in ultimately shaping a bill or shaping a policy and in a defined area. Committees also have, committee staff who are able to augment the staff in member offices with additional depth and expertise that, again, gives the committee the ability to take on a lot more meaty and weedy issues because they have such expertise. So, under regular order or when things move the way they're supposed to go, the committees, legislation is referred to a committee or sometimes multiple committees, and the committees then act or many times don't act on legislation, and this gives them an important role as a gatekeeper. When legislation does come up before the committee, a lot of times the member who sponsors it, the staff who are on the committee will work back and forth to say, okay, we like the general principle, but can we refine this, or we have this feedback from the agency, what about this point? And then through the committee process, it can be modified further, and then ultimately, goal being that you get this bill passed out or reported out of committee. So while clearing a committee is not a guarantee that it's going to get enacted into law, and no final guarantor of success, it is an indicator. So it is something to look at in terms of, does a bill make it through a committee? Does it get through both committees in both chambers? And is a very important step in the overall legislative process. So of course, who sits on committees and how are these committees determined? So parties have ways to structure and make their decisions through party leadership, steering committee, and other apparatus to drive or make committee assignments. You have a lot of competition for roles on certain committees, particularly committees like Energy and Commerce and Finance that have jurisdiction over many important areas of the economy like healthcare. And then chairmanship typically has been determined by seniority, although that has shifted over time. You've seen more of a little bit of a departure, at least on the Republican side, from straight seniority to some other factors playing a role here. And you also have term limits are an issue that the Republican caucus deals with, including pretty tight term limits on the House side where a member can serve 6 years at the top of a committee as either the chairman or the ranking member. And that's why, in this case, we have a new chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee because Chairman Fred Upton, who shepherded through the 21st Century Cures Act, spent 6 years at the top and he was term limited. So we have a new chairman this Congress. In the Senate, it's a little more flexible. As Stuart mentioned, Senator Hatch has chaired the Help Committee. He's now chairing the Finance Committee because you get 6 years, right, as chair or ranker. So you have a little bit more fluidity and movement back and forth, but you still have a term limit there. And the committee ratios or the balance of power typically reflect the partisan makeup of the Congress. So if it's a narrow majority, the committees are more evenly divided. If it's a significant majority, you tend to see a greater balance for the majority party. And just, I thought it's always interesting looking at some statistics. So I looked back at the last Congress and you had just more of 12,000 pieces of legislation. This is bills and resolutions introduced in the last 2-year period of Congress that ended at the end of 2016. This does not include the amendments, which are quite plentiful, particularly on the Senate side. You had about 5% of those bills receive a vote in one of the chambers, and about 3% only of those bills were enacted into law. So it's a pretty high bar to get enacted into law these days. Although, we don't want to discourage anyone, and I do want to note that, you have bills like 21st Century Cures, which was an omnibus piece of legislation that included truly hundreds of pieces of smaller pieces of legislation in that final package. So there are ways to move the needle, to move a bill into law, even if that bill does not get enacted as a standalone piece of legislation. And just a few final points I'll leave you with as you're making your priorities for your asks and for your group's asks. And policy priorities. Membership is certainly an important factor to keep in mind when thinking about who you want to lead or co-lead something that you're working on, but it shouldn't be the only factor. Lawmakers who are not sitting on committees can and do achieve results. We've had significant experience working with members who are not on committees, but who work the process. They work closely with others on the committee, with the leadership of the committee, and they ultimately are committed to getting something done. So having a fierce, deeply motivated and passionate and informed advocate who's not on the committee can, again, be immensely helpful to your goals and objectives. And sometimes you even have members who are on committees who might be a little reluctant to take on an issue because they want to make sure they're not taking on too much that sits before their committee. They want to keep a more of an open approach to how they go about their business. So you sometimes will encounter some concerns from members on committee who are either going to take a small number of priorities and be less willing to take on others. So ultimately, the message I think is don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. You want to advance your idea, work with the committed champions, try and get it as bipartisan, bicameral as you can make it, and work it from there to make progress and move the ball forward.